Europe was watching. Two world leaders, Viktor Orbán of Hungary and Donald Trump of the United States, side by side, both rejecting Europe's migration policies.
If somebody would like to come to Hungary, first he should ask for that. If he gives the permission, they can step in. Nobody can step on the territory of Hungary without having a permission from the Hungarian authorities.
In the heart of the European Union, Hungary had become the first country to openly defy the EU's refugee quotas and build a wall to protect its national sovereignty. And the world listened. But what was behind this bold defiance? Was it fear, racism, or a matter of identity? In a moment that would define Europe's migration crisis, Hungary was taking a stand. And it wasn't just about migrants. It was about the future of Europe itself. In 2015, as the refugee crisis exploded in Europe, millions of Syrians, Afghans, and Africans were fleeing war, persecution, and poverty. European leaders were scrambling to find solutions, and the EU responded by proposing refugee quotas. Each country would take in a set number of refugees to share the burden. But Hungary, led by Viktor Orbán, wasn't having it. Hungary became one of the first EU countries to openly reject the EU's migration policies. Orbán's government refused to accept any refugees, citing concerns that migrants from Muslim-majority countries would threaten Hungary's Christian identity and national security. Orbán's hardline stance wasn't just about rejecting quotas. It was a nationalist movement that would pit Hungary against the European Union, human rights organizations, and much of mainstream Europe. Hungary wasn't just opposing the quotas with words. It was building a wall, literally. Orbán's government constructed a massive border fence to block migrants from entering through Serbia and Croatia. The fence became a symbol of Hungary's resistance to the EU's migration policies and a clear message to Brussels: we will protect our borders. The border fence wasn't the only measure Hungary took. In 2018, Orbán's government passed the Stop Soros law, which criminalized aiding illegal migrants. NGOs and groups trying to assist migrants were targeted, making it illegal to help refugees seeking asylum. For Orbán, this was about preserving Hungary's sovereignty and cultural values. But for many in Europe, this was an attack on human rights and a step toward authoritarianism. But Hungary wasn't alone in its defiance. Poland, under the leadership of Jarosław Kaczynski and Andrzej Duda, also refused to accept the EU's refugee quotas. Poland, however, chose a different path. It didn't build walls or criminalize NGOs, but instead took a more political stance, rejecting the idea that Muslim migrants could be safely integrated into Polish society. In the European debate on migration, Poland and Hungary became the leading critics of EU immigration policies. Together, they formed a nationalist bloc challenging Brussels' power. But while Poland took a more diplomatic approach, Hungary confronted the EU head-on with policies that were harder to ignore. Viktor Orbán didn't just reject migration. He also used anti-immigrant rhetoric to create a narrative that resonated deeply with many Hungarians. Orbán framed immigration as an existential threat to Hungary's Christian identity and cultural heritage. He called mass migration a threat to Europe's future and argued that Hungary's future could only be secure if it remained a homogeneous Christian nation. This rhetoric tapped into a deep-rooted nationalist sentiment in Hungary, where many feared that their traditional culture and religious values were being eroded by foreign influences. Orbán's policies, including his harsh stance on Muslim migration, played into this fear, capitalizing on it to consolidate political power. As Hungary's resistance grew, it wasn't just a political dispute, it became a legal battle with the European Union. In 2017, the European Court of Justice ruled that Hungary must comply with EU refugee relocation quotas. Orbán ignored the ruling. By refusing to comply, Hungary challenged the EU's authority and its ability to enforce shared rules among member states. This was a major test for the EU, a union that prided itself on shared values and common laws. But Orbán's defiance didn't stop there. He also demonized the EU bureaucracy and liberal European values, framing Hungary as a bulwark against the Islamization of Europe. Hungary's refusal to comply with EU directives became a symbol of a larger political struggle between sovereignty and EU unity. Orbán's hardline approach to migration didn't just secure his position in Hungary, it made him an icon for far-right populists across Europe. In countries like Italy, Austria, and Poland, Orbán's nationalist rhetoric gained traction. He became a model for right-wing leaders who saw in him a strongman capable of defending national sovereignty against what they viewed as the overreach of the EU and liberal elites. Orbán's illiberal democracy approach, which emphasized national sovereignty over EU integration, became the inspiration for far-right political movements across the continent. Today, Hungary's defiance remains. The border fence is still in place. Hungary has not changed its position on immigration, and Orbán remains one of Europe's most controversial and resilient leaders. But with Hungary's defiance growing more isolated, many are asking, can Hungary remain a member of the EU while rejecting the very principles that define it? How long can Orbán continue to defy European laws and principles before Hungary faces serious repercussions? Hungary's refusal to accept refugees is just one part of a larger identity crisis playing out in Europe. And while Orbán's policies have made him popular among a significant portion of the Hungarian population, the question remains, what happens when a country decides it no longer shares the values of the rest of Europe? Hungary's defiance of the EU's migration policies was not just about borders, it was about Hungarian identity, an identity that Orbán's government aimed to protect from what it saw as the threat of cultural and religious erosion. But as Hungary dug in its heels against the EU, the question remained, could a nation with a fractured relationship with Europe continue to thrive in a united continent? Orbán's message, constantly hammered home, was that Hungary's Christian identity was being eroded by the migration crisis. He framed the refugee influx as a cultural invasion, something that not only threatened the country's way of life, but also its very values. Hungary, in Orbán's eyes, was the last bulwark standing against the flood of migrants that were destabilizing Europe. But as Orbán's rhetoric grew stronger, Hungary's relationship with the EU grew weaker. The European Union is built on principles of solidarity and shared responsibility. But Orbán's Hungary wanted none of that. Hungary's refusal to accept the EU's quotas was a direct challenge to the EU's core mission to ensure that all member states share the burden of crises. Orbán made it clear that Hungary would go its own way, a defiance that sent shockwaves across Europe. For many in Brussels, this wasn't just an issue of migration, it was a test of European unity. If one country could flout EU laws with impunity, what would stop others from doing the same? And while Hungary's refusal to comply with EU mandates was a clear political statement, it also ignited a fierce debate about the future of Europe. Should a nation be able to break EU laws in the name of national sovereignty? Should the EU's rules on migration be enforced equally among its member states? These questions remain unanswered, and Hungary remains the flashpoint. But it wasn't just the EU that was growing concerned about Orbán's approach. Orbán's rhetoric about defending European culture and Christianity became increasingly nationalistic and exclusionary. He was appealing directly to Hungary's right-wing populist base, which saw him as a defender of traditional European values. Orbán's rhetoric was fueling fears that Islamic migrants would flood the continent, undermine European democracy, and impose a foreign religion. But in this climate, critics argued that Orbán's message was divisive and anti-democratic. Hungary's rise as a far-right stronghold has made it a key player in the broader populist wave sweeping across Europe. Orbán is not alone in his defiance. In countries like Poland, Italy, and Austria, right-wing populist parties have gained traction by appealing to the same fears Orbán voiced, that European identity was under threat from migration. Orbán's policies and rhetoric have made him a hero to populist leaders across the continent, from Marine Le Pen in France to Matteo Salvini in Italy. And as the far-right gains strength, Hungary is increasingly seen as the vanguard of a new nationalist movement in Europe. Orbán's vision of Hungary as a Christian, homogeneous nation has made him a popular figure in some circles, but his defiant policies also marginalized Hungary on the global stage. By rejecting EU refugee quotas, Orbán placed Hungary at odds not just with the European Union, but also with human rights organizations. Hungary's treatment of migrants, especially refugees, became a matter of international scrutiny. Humanitarian organizations have accused Hungary of violating international law, particularly with its decision to keep asylum seekers in overcrowded and unsanitary camps on the border. Hungary's refusal to allow asylum seekers to register and its harsh treatment of migrants attempting to cross the border led to accusations of inhumanity. Yet Orbán remained defiant, insisting that Hungary had a right to protect its sovereignty. and that its policies were necessary for the security and stability of the country. But as Orbán's policies hardened, Hungary began to feel the internal pressure of its stance on migration. While Orbán's government successfully garnered popular support from Hungarians, who feared the effects of mass migration, the situation in the country grew more complicated. Despite Orbán's hardline stance, many Hungarians began to question whether the benefits of isolation outweighed the costs. The economic strain on Hungary's public services was already a challenge. Healthcare, education, and welfare systems were already under pressure due to Hungary's aging population. But the growing social tension caused by Orbán's policies was beginning to show its cracks. Hungary's rejection of migrants and refugees, while popular among some sections of society, created a new problem: integration. With refugees stranded on Hungary's borders and other EU countries resettling refugees in their own territories, Hungary was increasingly seen as isolated in Europe. The political isolation Hungary faced only deepened its relationship with far-right populist governments. Hungary's refusal to join the EU's refugee resettlement scheme made it a lonely outpost in the fight for Europe's future. As the years passed, Hungary's relationship with the EU continued to unravel. Orbán's illiberal democracy model, based on national sovereignty and Christian values, grew increasingly isolated. The EU had no choice but to respond. In 2019, the European Parliament passed a motion against Hungary, citing its violations of European values like democracy and human rights. The European Commission launched legal actions against Hungary, seeking to sanction Orbán's government for its authoritarian policies. Orbán continued to stand his ground. His government implemented more authoritarian measures, from silencing critics and media freedom restrictions to strengthening his control over the judiciary. Orbán's increasing autocratic control was turning Hungary into a symbol of defiance, not just to migration policies, but to liberal European ideals. As Hungary continues to clash with the EU, the question remains: can Hungary continue to be part of the European Union while rejecting the very values that have made the EU what it is? Can a country that challenges EU policies, refuses migrants, and controls its media remain a member of a union that prides itself on shared values? Hungary's future in the EU is uncertain, and its stance on migration is a major factor in determining whether the country will continue its path of resistance, or whether it will face serious repercussions for its defiance. Orbán's Hungary is not a case study in failure, but a warning. As Europe wrestles with its own identity and future, Hungary stands as a powerful symbol of resistance, fighting not just against migration, but for its vision of Europe. And while Hungary remains steadfast in its defiance, the world is watching. What happens when Europe's borderlands no longer share the same vision of the future? As Hungary's defiance continues, the pressure on its government is mounting. Orbán's vision for Hungary as a Christian nation, fiercely resistant to migration, is beginning to take a toll on the country's international relationships. Hungary, once celebrated for its transition to democracy, is now seen as a symbol of the rise of nationalism and the decline of liberal values in Europe. Orbán's push for illiberal democracy, a term he coined to describe his vision of national sovereignty over European cooperation, has put Hungary at odds with its European allies. Germany, France, and the rest of the EU are struggling to reconcile Hungary's policies with the fundamental ideals of the Union. The question is simple: can Hungary remain in the EU while rejecting the core values of that very Union? Europe's tensions over migration are not unique to Hungary. In fact, they represent a broadening rift that stretches from the Baltics to the Mediterranean. The political landscape of Europe is shifting. Countries once committed to liberal, open border policies are now facing the rise of far-right populism that exploits fears of cultural change and the threat of radical Islam. But Hungary's situation is unique. Hungary has chosen this path of defiance. While countries like Poland, Italy, and Austria also reject the EU's migration policies, they have not gone as far as Orbán. No other country in Europe has so openly embraced nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment in the way Hungary has. In many ways, Hungary is the test case for the future of European populism. If Orbán's policies continue to work, it could embolden other European nations to follow suit, leading to a fracturing of the EU from within. The European Union itself is caught in a paradox. It wants to maintain its unity, its commitment to shared values, and its open borders. Yet the political realities of immigration, the strain on social services, rising crime in certain migrant-heavy districts, and the feeling among many citizens that their cultures are being threatened are real. Orbán has found a message that resonates with a significant portion of the Hungarian population and with populist movements across Europe. In Brussels, leaders argue that solidarity should be the guiding principle, that EU countries must share the responsibility of dealing with refugees. Yet Orbán's refusal to comply with EU mandates challenges this very concept. Hungary is a member state. It signed up to the EU's rules and laws, but by defying them, Orbán forces the EU into a difficult choice. Do they expel Hungary and risk the future of the EU, or do they compromise their core values in the name of unity? One thing is certain, Hungary's rejection of migration isn't just about migrants. It's about something much deeper, Europe's identity. The EU was founded on the idea of unity in diversity, a union where different cultures, languages, and traditions could coexist and thrive under a shared set of democratic principles. But Orbán's Hungary challenges this vision. For Orbán, Europe's future lies in protecting national identities, religions, and cultures. His vision is a Europe where individual nations can maintain their autonomy and safeguard their own interests without being forced to compromise to a larger, more diverse union. The internal divisions within Hungary are equally concerning. While Orbán has garnered widespread support among certain factions of Hungarian society, there's also a growing opposition to his policies. In Hungary, many citizens are beginning to feel the economic strain of Orbán's anti-immigration stance. Hungary's healthcare, education, and welfare systems were already stretched thin before Orbán took power. The refugee crisis exacerbated these challenges, but Orbán's policies have made it even harder for Hungary to access European resources and aid meant to assist countries struggling with migration. In the long run, Hungary's resistance could lead to economic isolation, forcing Orbán's government to face the reality that national sovereignty doesn't come for free. The country's political isolation, combined with the economic strain of resisting EU migration policies, may leave Hungary's government without the resources it needs to maintain its populist agenda. Hungary's future in the EU is also closely linked to the ongoing rise of far-right populism across Europe. The nationalist wave Orbán has helped create could become even more powerful if his approach continues to resonate with voters in other countries. Orbán has made it clear that migration is at the heart of his political platform, and other EU leaders are now being forced to reckon with the same questions about sovereignty and identity that Orbán has already answered, at least for Hungary. In Poland, Italy, and Austria, populist leaders are already following Orbán's example, capitalizing on anti-immigrant sentiment and nationalism. And in countries like Germany, France, and the Netherlands, where the immigration debate remains a divisive issue, the rise of far-right movements is gaining momentum. The EU is at a crossroads. Orbán has presented a bold vision for Hungary's future, a country that refuses to be governed by EU laws, that rejects migration and embraces a nationalist vision rooted in Christianity and traditional values. For Hungary, Orbán's stance has solidified his power and earned him loyalty from his supporters. But for Europe, Hungary's defiance raises a crucial question. Can a union built on shared values survive if member states decide to go their own way? Orbán's Hungary may have found a short-term victory in its defiance, but the long-term consequences for both Hungary and Europe are far from clear. As migration continues to be a central issue, the clash between national sovereignty and EU unity will define the future of Europe. As the rest of Europe watches Hungary's increasingly defiant stance, the question remains: what happens when a country decides it will no longer follow the rules that have held Europe together for decades? Hungary may be the first to take this stand, but it won't be the last. The future of the EU hangs in the balance. If you want to understand how these forces are reshaping countries across Europe and beyond, make sure to watch the next video. Because this story isn't over, it's only beginning.